Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar on a unified approach to tackle export controls, NIST 800-171, which covers CUI, Controlled Unclassified Information, and CMMC. Today's webinar we're doing in conjunction with Deloitte. So I'll have a couple representatives from Deloitte on the webinar as well. Just first to go over some logistics. Any questions that you have during the webinar, please use the Zoom Q&A interface. There should be a button at the bottom of the Zoom window that allows you to ask any questions. You can ask those questions anytime during the webinar. We may answer some of them during the webinar, and then we also have a dedicated Q&A section at the end. Also, this webinar will be recorded. Everyone who registered for the webinar and attended the webinar will receive a link to that recording after the webinar is complete and after we have time to process and upload the video. That video, you can send that link on to anyone you think might be interested. So with that, we'll get started. Just briefly going over the agenda today. I'll give an introduction to those of us who will be speaking during the webinar today. And then we'll go into an introduction to export controls and CMMC and cover some of the commonalities between the two. We'll talk a little bit about challenges for industry, and then we'll go into a unified approach to address both export controls and CMMC. Then we'll have some time where I'll be doing a Next Labs solution demo, and then we'll move into the Q&A portion at the end. So to introduce those of us who will be on the call, there's myself, Tony Burning. I'm a Senior Product Manager here at Next Labs, and I'm joined by my colleague, Pratap Sakala, who's a VP of Engineering at Next Labs, and he'll join us for the Q&A portion at the end. And then I'm joined by both Sean Ryan and Keith Thompson from Deloitte, who have joined to offer their expertise. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And I will turn it over to Keith.
Okay, so just a little background on the cybersecurity maturity model certification. I would imagine that many of you who are listening to this webinar, you probably have heard of it or somewhat familiar with it, but it's always helpful to kind of talk through, the background, where it came from, where it's going, and maybe some of the implications of not aligning with CMMC. So as a brief history, it all started with the Department of Defense with NIST 800-171 and the DFARS 7012 clause roughly about 4 years ago, which was in effect in 2017. That NIST 800-171 consists of 110 security practices, and that DFARS 7012 clause required defense contractors to self-certify that they've aligned with them. They were essentially telling the DoD that they've aligned with all 110 controls and move forward and continue to execute on projects. Well, over the last couple of years, the DoD and the defense industrial base had decided that that's just not good enough to protect the controlled unclassified information. That's how CMMC was born. Essentially, the difference between that legacy NIST 800-171 clause and the cybersecurity maturity model is largely because of the third-party assessor. The DoD and the defense industrial base had decided that having this third-party assessor come in and validate that organizations are indeed aligning with a set of security controls is way more effective than having the NIST 800-171 self-assessment. So as they move forward over the last couple of years, in 2019, really they started to publish this. In 2020, the version 1 of CMMC was released, and as we probably know, this is largely based on just protecting that controlled unclassified information, that sensitive information, which we'll talk about in a little bit of what that is, and protecting that information from being leaked to the public. But in January 2020, the first version was released. They have gone through multiple reviews over the last couple of years, and last year they decided that they trained the first set of provisional certified assessors. So the way this will work is you'll have a set of certified assessors that work for certified third-party assessor organizations, and those certified assessors will come out and do the assessments and report to the accreditation body for the DoD for CMMC. Over the last year, there's been a lot of churn within the DoD as well as with the accreditation body, and there have been some roadblocks. So the timeline used to be they were going to try to include this requirement within the DoD RFPs early this year, 2021. Well, it's been a little bit delayed. So they're going through the process. There are currently a small handful of certified third-party assessor organizations out there. There's only 100 certified assessors, me being one of them. Deloitte has a couple of those assessors within our organization, and there's been some delays in getting this released to defense contractors. After in talking with our clients and talking with the certified third-party assessors and the accreditation body, it appears as though this CMMC requirement will start appearing in RFPs late this year or early next year, with a target of organizations having to go through the first round of assessments in the spring to summer of next year. It is a requirement. It'll be in the RFPs, and it is said that over 300,000 organizations will need to have a cybersecurity model certification at some point. So you can think of it as that license to do business with the DoD. So when we think about what that means, what exactly is the cybersecurity maturity model certification? It's organized by practices, processes, and capabilities, as you can see on the slide. Level 1 being basic cyber hygiene, all the way up to level 5 being the advanced progressive practices. So when we think about what level 1 means, there's no real. There are 17 practices ranging from access security to asset management, and then CUI tagging, of course. And then it goes up from there. So when we think about level 2, I believe it's around 50 some practices. But on top of that, organizations will need to have these documented. If you see on the bottom where you see maturity level 2, where it says ML2.999, establish a policy that includes each one of the 17 domains. And it also requires to have procedural documents. So essentially, if your requirement is to be a level 2, now you have to have it actually documented. Now we get into moving to level 3. This is really where the rubber hits the road. This is where controlled unclassified information must be protected, and organizations have to have a little bit more of a proactive approach to protecting that controlled unclassified information. So when we think about maturity level 3, now you have 130 cybersecurity practices that have to be implemented. And on top of that, you have to have those same level 2 requirements to include the policy and procedures. And level 3, now you have to talk about a resource plan. So organizations now have to articulate how they're going to maintain that CMMC, program on a go-forward basis. And finally, we move into level 4 and level 5. Obviously, they're a little bit more rigorous, but you can kind of see how this is made up over the span of maturity level 1 all the way up to maturity level 5. Over the last couple of months, we've worked with a number of organizations, and there are significant challenges. Moving from NIST 800-171 into a maturity level 3 requires some funding, requires some resources to actually go and take on those challenges. Maturity level 4 has created its own challenges as well, related to monitoring and measuring for effectiveness for the activities related to CMMC. So we'll get into a little bit more on those challenges as we move forward. But in the meantime, let me pass this over to Sean to talk a little bit more about export control and how that relates to CMMC.
So thanks Keith, and hi everybody. As we look at what Keith talked through around CMMC and in general around cybersecurity and the different processes, the practices, the capabilities that are in place, we're working a lot with clients in many areas to embed export control considerations alongside cybersecurity practices. A big part of this is around the challenges relating to data, and in particular, when you look at CMMC, is that the data that's controlled from an export perspective, when you're looking at ITAR and ER data, is also part of CUI data. So therefore, it's part of CMMC itself, and therefore the controls really need to reflect the fact that you're managing from the CMMC standpoint, and also from an export controls perspective. This is really part of the growing intersection between cyber and export, where the use of tools, the security of information, technical data access, and also just the data flows in general will trigger export requirements on top of cybersecurity considerations. A big focus here is on business transformation as well, and enabling the business while you have the movement of data. You may be going through digital transformations. It could be that there's a cloud migration. You're looking at an everything as a service model. There are various different drivers to enable internal and external folks to get access to data, and really to leverage a lot of the time cyber tools to enable export control requirements to be met. The key areas are really around data identification and classification, data hosting and the systems challenges, and also data management processes and user controls. So really, export controls itself has, as many of you will know, there have been requirements around how you manage the data and how you share that with parties, licenses in place, etc., and really technology control plans to manage that. I think that now there really is a formal link with cyber and with the CMMC piece. The next part is really, and as I mentioned on the next slide, is around export controls and QA. You'll see from the examples of the types of QA data that are there, that there's certainly, ITAR data as part of that consideration, controlled technical information. There's certain EAR data that's part of that. But in addition, there are a number of different areas, and maybe Keith can mention some of the other types of QA data that are part of CMMC and therefore are part of developing the processes, the practices, and the capabilities to manage that.
Yeah, sure. I think that the big things that we're seeing with our organizations now, obviously, this spans outside of your typical aerospace and defense contractor. When you think of those large 4 or 5 defense contractors that make the planes and the bombs and the rockets and everything, this spans outside of that normal DoD contractor. So when we think about it, military personnel records. So a lot of med tech organizations who work with the DoD handle military personnel records. Obviously, Sean talked a little bit about ITAR. Also, they handle patient data and records like that for these med tech organizations. A lot of technology organizations are getting some of that controlled technical information. If they're handling power equipment or HVAC equipment within a given military base, sometimes they get that critical infrastructure security information as well. So it really runs a gamut in terms of the types of information that are out there. And I encourage most organizations to consult with their general counsel for interpretation of not only CMMC but the definition of controlled unclassified information, which is located within NARA. NARA basically published a lot of this stuff related to CUI, and kind of get that a feel for what types of information that you might be using within your organization.
Yeah. And just to add around this is that what we have seen as well is that a lot of the time it falls on the company to understand, okay, what is QA from a regulatory standpoint, and then what does it mean for their business and the types of documents or information that they have in different platforms. Coming up with a company-specific definition of QA is similar to, from an export control standpoint, looking across your data sets and understanding, okay, what do we consider as ITAR data? What types of documents do we have to look at? And then how do we then, go through that classification process and then build controls around the different data sets. So I think the experience from an export control standpoint that many companies in the A&D space have had is something that can kind of be leveraged from a wider CMMC standpoint around that data classification, tagging, marking, and management. Okay, So we also have here, you'll see some export controls and CMMC crossover areas. Primarily on the left-hand side, you'll see that there are technical data domains, if you like, and more crossover. Whereas on the right, a lot of it's around some of the technical aspects related to the security, system management, and really the resilience and vigilance around cybersecurity. On the left, you'll see that a lot of it is around governance and around and the security tie over. So, for example, export controls from a risk management standpoint, and really the starting point is obviously looking across your business, across the activities, and across the kind of data sets and identifying where the risk is, going through access controls, developing policies and procedures, making sure that as per ITAR that there's appropriate encryption safeguards to manage the control data, especially when that's either at rest or also when that is being exchanged and maintained in other places. So really those areas you'll see that CMMC captures that, and also those are typical export control drivers when you get into looking at, okay, how do we classify, how do we manage the data, and how do we build the program in place that can enable CMMC going through that assessment process and making sure that you can get certified and able to bid on those DoD contracts. So I think this just really highlights that there is quite a bit of crossover between export controls and CMMC, and there's also additional requirements from CMMC that IT and cyber professionals will be charged with managing, especially when you're looking at those specific cybersecurity domains. So that kind of takes us to the challenges for industry. Keith, myself, and our wider colleagues at Deloitte, we've been doing a lot of work with our clients in this area, and we've identified certain parts of the process as you're going through CMMC, as you're building your program, developing it, and preparing for assessments, etc. There's some specific challenges here that you can see that we've been helping clients with. So one of them that we've talked about, and just to re-emphasize it, is around the CUI and the export control boundary. And also that flows into the kind of identification and the classification piece. A lot of that is around, which business or business line or part of the organization are you going to look at. That tends to come from a risk analysis standpoint in terms of, where is the risk for the business, where are you potentially, having to look at your suppliers that are part of your supply chain and understanding how they're managing CUI and export controls as part of your offerings. I think that's outside of the normal DoD contractor approach, but really does a lot of the time help where you can leverage what has happened from an export control standpoint and some of the supplier management audits that understand that if where you have controlled products or controlled technical data and the controls that you have around that, and that itself flows into the assessment evidence and making sure that there's the right level of kind of documented evidence, and the controls themselves are documented. You can evidence the cyber security aspects, and you can also point to how you're identifying and managing this type of data, both from a process and technology control plans perspective, and also from a cybersecurity perspective. And the other two areas, just the challenges that we've seen are around the timing. As Keith said, there's been, this has been in the works for some time, and there's been some delays in terms of CMMC. It's also, when their clients need to take action, it's a big piece of it in terms of, as we talked about before, do you want to look at a business or a specific business line? That all flows into, how are you going to approach it and what's your timescale looking like? And a big part of this as well is around alignment across the organization. That can happen from leadership. making sure that we have the investment in place to build the controls that we need to put them into the business and implement them. But also a lot of time this will involve cross-functional employees. So not just your export controls and IT organizations, but, it will have an impact, and you will need buy-in from groups such as, R&D, your sales, your procurement, where there may be access to QA or export control data. So really, this is an organizational wide initiative, and it's something that you need that alignment, and you need the buy-in, and you need to make sure that it's getting the right level of scrutiny and attention to get to the point where, CMMC is part of it, almost like part of your day-to-day activities. So here we'll see, and Keith's going to lead us through the kind of approach to export controls and CMMC. And just one thing at the start, before I hand over, is that, really, I think what we found is that some of the best practices and some of the experience of DoD contractors based on export controls and how you manage that data is something that can be leveraged to the wider QA data set. But that is something where we've seen the export controls subject matter experts within a company really act as that kind of driver and sharing their experience, because it can be applied across the CMMC piece.
Sure. And so now let's think about what organizations are doing, or what you could consider doing as you kind of move forward in your CMMC and ITAR journey. Most organizations just starting out with a simple readiness assessment. Sometimes they might have their internal self-assessments that have been completed. They've updated their scores and spurs and things like that. But a lot of times they get a third party to come in and do these readiness assessments. The big step in here is related to scoping, related to understanding where controlled unclassified information resides, or ITAR data resides within your environment. Having assessors come in, whether they're registered practitioners or certified provisional assessors, is important because they have an understanding of what they've seen elsewhere throughout the market. Looking at things like your SSP and your plan of action and milestones to understand what the current state looks like, so you can develop that roadmap for remediation. Very important steps as you go through this readiness assessment part. Additionally, on top of that is the CUI data management strategy. Most of the time, when we walk into organizations, a lot of times we see, where they have a mixture of commercial and DoD data, it's very challenging for them to understand their own internal processes, so that they can minimize that burden of compliance across the organization by managing their CUI appropriately and minimizing the spread of that CUI across the environment. And that brings it into that next topic related to supply chain risk management. A big piece of how organizations are looking at CMMC is how they're managing their internal controlled unclassified information, but also preventing them from passing it to suppliers unnecessarily. So, for example, you might be making a product for the DoD, and the supply chain folks will sometimes pass information to the suppliers that includes controlled unclassified information, and those suppliers didn't necessarily need to see that controlled unclassified information to fulfill the requirements on their contract. So it really comes down to managing your own internal CUI and managing how you send it across your organization, and really understanding how you are limiting the exposure of your supply chain to minimize the ultimate burden of compliance for serving the DoD. Now, after organizations have gone through this readiness and really understood how their supply chain risk management program ties into CMMC or export control, they go into the remediation process. Sometimes this might take a couple months. Sometimes it could take a couple of years. It really depends on the maturity of the organization, the complexity around your CUI boundary. Policy and procedures is always an issue for organizations, especially when it relates to tying it to CMMC. Support governance model, the governance model. So this is related to your resource planning and how your organization manages their cybersecurity posture, as well as their CMMC program. And then finally, the data management and data classification. This is a big piece that organizations struggle with. So it might be tools, it might be people, it might be processes to be implemented. There's a host of solutions related to digital management data management, and data classification. Finally, organizations will sometimes outsource many of their CMMC processes to third parties as a managed service. This goes from cloud managed services to cybersecurity managed services, and also working with your third party assessor. So there's many options out there for organizations to leverage in terms of getting their organization ready for CMMC. And finally, the whole project management piece of it, and this is governance around your your roadmap to the CMMC readiness. Really, just setting up that structure up front. Organizations start their program, understanding what the roadmap looks like for the near term to get themselves ready. Standing up that that program management structure is a critical piece to actually getting ready for CMMC.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks, Sean. So now I'm going to go into a little bit of how you would define a data-centric security framework that covers both the requirements for expert control and CMMC. So, so one way to think about it is that there's these 5 steps that you need to take. So the first one is really identifying what kinds of data you have, like what data do you have that needs to be controlled, and that some of it may be classified, some of it may be the CUI, controlled unclassified information, but really identifying what types of data you have. And then and the second step then is understanding more things about that data. So understanding like the sources of that regulated and sensitive data, understanding where you're keeping that data, how you're moving that data, how you're using that data, who's using it, how you're sharing it, really understanding how you're using that data. Then the third step is controlling that data, controlling access to that data, and that's through establishing policies, internal controls, governance models, defining the audits that are required to ensure proper control over that data. And then you need to protect that data. So with those controls in place, then you also need to implement the correct protections, the correct levels of data protections for the different types of data and how they're being used. And finally, the last piece, and certainly not the least, is being able to audit everything that you've put in place. So having that reporting and the auditing in place, the paper trail to show how you're using it, like what data you're using, how you're using it, what controls are being put in place, and how you're protecting that data as you're using it. So within Next Labs, the way that we like to think about it, this really applies to like our products and how we approach delivering solutions, is that there are 4 main components. And I'll go into each of these in a little bit more detail on the next slide, but at a high level, the first is that you need to identify and classify your data. Then you need to protect the data at its source, where it's being kept. You need to protect the data on the move and when it's being shared. So whenever it's being sent anywhere, whenever it's being going between systems. And then finally, you need to be monitoring, auditing, and reporting on the data as it's being used and as it's being protected. So to go into each of those in a little bit more detail, first, identifying and classifying data. So you need to know what kind of data you have. You need to know whether it's how valuable it is to you. Where is it stored and managed? What are the risks of, if any of that data is compromised? And is it subject to any regulations or controls, whether governments or industry requirements? And then you need to also identify which applications are the ones that are using that data and managing that data. And so then you need to be able to protect the data at the source. So you need to be focusing on the applications that are using that data. You need to be focusing on using the attributes of the data and the applications that are using it. And this is where the attribute-based access control model, or ABAC, is a core piece of how to do this. So classifying the data, identifying the attributes, and then also putting in security based on those attributes as a critical piece. Next step is protecting the data on the move and when it's shared. So critical data is often taken from the source and then shared with partners, with other, or within an organization, So it's being moved around, and it needs to be protected when it's being moved around. So this is where it's important to protect that data with digital rights management, so that it's properly encrypted, and only the people who should have access to it are able to access to it, even when it's been moved from its source and moved to another location. And then finally, the piece of monitoring, auditing, and reporting, being able to monitor all security events, being able to monitor any changes to policies. This is all important both to ensure that everything is implemented correctly and that your systems are secure, as well as for regulatory authorities. So for showing that you are in compliance with export controls, for CMMC requirements. All of this is, in many ways, as important of a step as the others, because if you can't show that you are correctly, protecting your data, then it's very hard to know for certain that you are protecting it appropriately. So with that, I'm going to jump into some demos of how we are implementing such a unified solution for export control and CMMC using Next Labs products. So let's go into those demos now. Let's take a look at how we can use Next Labs to implement access controls for export control compliance in SAP ECC or S/4HANA. We're going to consume the classification data of materials in the SAP GTS system to enforce access controls in the SAP ECC or the S/4 system. In this scenario, there are two users, a demo user 1 and a demo user 2, whose citizenships are the United States and China respectively. There are two materials, one material RM2331, which is classified as ITAR in the SAP GTS system, and another material that is not classified. For this example, we will use the MM03 transaction, but in principle, the access controls will work the same across the entire SAP landscape. Here's the example GTS system. There is an SAP S/4 system as well as an SAP GTS system in the landscape where the classification of materials are maintained. The systems communicate with each other via an RFC or remote function call. The Next Labs platform communicates via the standard HTTPS protocol using a REST-based API. So now we can dive into the system and take a look at a basic sample policy that's defined to achieve export compliance. Here we have a top deny policy that's set to deny access to ITAR classified data in HE9. HE9 is the SAP or S/4HANA system. As you can see here, the policy is a deny policy and the subject component is empty. This means that this policy is applicable to any user across the SAP systems. There is a resource component which says Export Security ITAR, which means that any classified material that is tagged as Export Security ITAR is going to be denied for the user's access. We also specify the two systems across which this policy is applicable. In this policy, there are two systems, HE9 and the GTS system. This policy, we also specify some of the actions that users can try to execute in this transaction. If the user is denied, you can set what the user message will be, and that is defined in the obligation section. In this policy, we have it set to Next Labs ITAR classified data, no authorization. Best principle, the way we design policies is always have a top deny policy followed by an allow exception. So, who can access the ITAR data? We're going to allow access to the ITAR data based on citizenship. Where we have an allow policy, which is a sub-policy of the deny policy, which basically says that this policy is an allow policy and the subject component citizenship status is United States. So if the user has a citizenship of the United States, then they will be able to access the data. We also need to add the SAP system to which this policy is applicable. So now if a request comes in with the user attribute of a citizen equal to the United States, the deny policy will be applied, but since the user's citizenship is United States, it will be overridden by the allow policy. In that way, the United States citizens can access this ITAR classified data. Now let's take a quick look at the SAP GTS system. So in the SAP GTS system, we have material RM223 that is replicated in from the S4 system. Also, its legal regulation and classification is maintained as ITAR, and the numbering scheme is USML. Its USML number is 1A005, which is an ITAR classification number. Now let's jump to the S4 system and try to log in as a demo user 1. So I'm going to try to access the material master transaction. This is MMO3. As you can see, I have the material number RM2231 here. And when I try to access the data, I can see the data. We can see the data because a demo user 1 is a United States citizen. But now, let's log in as a demo user 2 who has Chinese citizenship. We'll go to MMO3 and try to access the same material. You can see that we're not allowed to see it. And we're getting the message from the Next Labs policy we said earlier, which is Next Labs ITAR classified data, no authorization. This is the message that was defined in the deny policy. So in this scenario, what has happened is that when the user tried to access the transaction MMO3 in the SAP S4HANA system, in real time, there's an RFC call that happens with SAP GTS. That's to fetch the classification of the material once the user enters the material. So if the classification data for export security is equal to ITAR, and also the USML details are fetched and are subjected to a policy controller check. Policy controller checks for the user citizenship attribute, as well as the resource the user is trying to access, to see whether it is classified as ITAR. If it is ITAR, and the user citizenship is United States, then the user is allowed to see the data. However, if the classification is ITAR and the user's citizenship is anything other than the United States, then they will be denied access. This is what happened in the case of a demo user 2, since they are not a US citizen. As a result, they were shown the deny message that we defined in the policy. In this example, we'll see how to safeguard CUI, especially unstructured data, using digital rights management. NextLabs has a product that supports digital rights management, and we use that product to protect unstructured data. This could be files that you download from SAP, such as the report that you're downloading, or maybe a PDF that is the output of a purchase order. Or it could be a 3D design document that is connected to your engineering record. Any data that comes out of SAP in an unstructured format, like a file, we can control access to that data. First of all, who can extract the data out of SAP, and then after extracting, who is allowed to see the contents of that particular file, even if that file is shared with somebody else, either inside or outside the organization. You can also add a watermark to the file so that even if someone takes a picture of the file, you can still trace it to the source based on the watermark. All of these capabilities are built into the product. We will demonstrate this functionality using this particular scenario outlined on the screen. We have 3 different users: BOM Engineer 1, BOM Project 1, and BOM Engineer 4. BOM Engineer 4 has no permissions, so they cannot download a specific document connected to a BOM in SAP. BOM Engineer 1, on the other hand, has full permissions. They can download, view, edit, or print the file. Finally, BOM Project 1 can view the file, but cannot edit the file. Let's take a look at it in the system. So this is Bomb Engineer 1 logged into the SAP system. They're going to run the transaction CS03, which is a display of a bomb. This is a material bomb that we have created, and on the material bomb in the header data, we have different DAR, document assignment records, that are connected to it. We're going to pick a specific DAR. This particular DAR has attachments connected to it as part of linked objects. As you can see, there are two attachments connected here. One is a cylinder, a VDS file, or a 3D visual drawing file. We also have an SAP Pocket Knife VDS file. Bomb Engineer 1 will try to view the file and also download the file. The file gets downloaded to the system temporarily and is open in the Enterprise Visual View. As you can see, the user can view the file. Now let's try to download the document and see whether it gets protected or not. I'm going to download this to a folder called Demo on the desktop on my system. As you can see, the file has been downloaded. It's in the desktop demo folder. You can also see that there's an extension NXL, which means that the file is protected. NXL is the extension that NextLabs gives to a file when it protects the document. We're using NextLabs' SkyDRM component as part of the solution. Now we're going to log in with Bomb Engineer 1 into the SkyDRM client. Now that we're logged in as Bomb Engineer 1, we can open the protected document. The document opens in the 3D Visual Enterprise Viewer. Since it is a 3D visual diagram, you can view and rotate it. You can also try to edit it. You can also see that there's a watermark that gets generated on the document with a user ID and also a date and timestamp. The watermark, if someone tries to take a picture or screenshot of the document, you'll be able to trace it back to the source. This can help with identifying the source of any leak of sensitive data. We can also see the permissions for this particular user on the file. Check that, we can go and view the file info. He has permissions to view, edit, print, save as, and also watermark the file. These are the permissions for Bomb Engineer 1 on this particular document. For the same document, let's try to check with a different user, such as Bomb Engineer 4, who does not have any permissions as per the policy. So now we're going to log in as Bomb Engineer 4. As you can see, it says access denied. Since this user does not have access to the file, they don't have permission to open it. This is based on the policy being enforced at the time of the document being protected. The time that you're downloading the document from SAP, that's when the DRM policy is applied to the document. That's why Bomb Engineer 4 is not able to view this particular document. You can also check with a different user, Bomb Project 1. They should be able to view the document, but not edit the document. So let's log in as the user bomb project 1. Okay, now let's look at the same document again. Before we open it, check the permissions of the file for this particular user. As you can see, they have the permission to view, print, save as, but does not have the permission to edit or add a watermark. This is in contrast to Bomb Engineer 1, who had every permission: view, edit, print, save as, and also watermark on this particular document. Let's try to open this document with the user Bomb Project 1. As you can see, they're able to view the file and there is no watermark. That is because we chose to exclude the watermark capabilities for this policy in this user. Now let's try to edit this document and see what happens. So we're going to change the color. We can try to choose Save As. As you can see, there's a pop-up that the user does not have permission to perform this particular action. For all the changes that we're trying to make, we will not be able to choose Save As. We can also try to save, and we get the error saying that we cannot save the model to the file. It shows that at the time of downloading a document from SAP, the document will be protected based on the policies, and that different users will have different permissions on the protected document. Let's take a look at the Control Center reporting. Control Center reports offer a visual representation of the data in Control Center from the evaluation of the defined data access policies. The data can be displayed in pie charts, bar charts, and tables. We can also configure alerts in Control Center. Alerts can be triggered when a particular event happens, such as the number of denied requests exceeds a pre-configured threshold. Now, let's look at how we can configure a report. Under the Reports tab, there are two pages: Policies and Audit Logs. The Policies tab allows us to configure a report for policy controller evaluation. The report's criteria is defined in the Report Query section. The main criteria available include the user policy, the policy decision, and everything else that you can see here. You can also define the starting and ending date of the report, as well as the type of report, which can be set to either table, bar chart, horizontal bar chart, or pie chart. For a bar chart or pie chart, we can also choose what to group by. For the purposes of this demo, we'll show how to configure a report to show the denied users from the past 30 days. For this particular report, the policy decision we are selecting is when the user is denied access. The resource name fields are left blank, and report type is bar chart. That's grouping by the user. If we run the report, we'll get a bar chart like this. We can also choose another report type, such as table. The Control Center report lets us to export the data shown by clicking the download button. Now let's move on to the audit logs section. The audit log section lets us view the actions taken by Control Center users within Control Center. Actions can be things like creating a policy, deleting a policy, or a user logging in or logging out. We can choose to view the create policy actions by selecting the create action and the policy entity. We can also select the start date for which we want to see policy creation events. When we run this report, we will see all the records of when policies were created. And we can see the data on what was created by clicking on the details link. Now we'll move on to the monitoring tab. The monitoring tab lets us configure monitors to trigger alerts based on pre-configured events that can occur. In the monitors tab, we can add or delete the monitors. Currently there are 2 monitors for both allow and deny policies. Let's look at how the deny policy monitor is defined. The deny policy monitor is configured to raise an alert if the number of records on average is 2 per day for the current quarter. In this case, it will show an alert in the Overview tab, and the level is configured as L3. Further conditions can be added in the filter step, such as we can choose which particular user should be filtered on, or we can configure the first name, policy, full name, and so on. We can also configure the tags to group multiple monitors together. So we can define the access control, such that we can restrict the access to this particular monitor. So in this demo, I've shown how to use the Control Center reporter to visualize the data from Control Center, and also the data from Policy Controller Evaluation. All right, now we'll open it up for questions. Again, you can ask any questions through the Zoom webinars interface. There should be a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. While giving everyone an opportunity to do that, I just want to reiterate and let everyone know again that this webinar has been recorded, and we will be sending out a link to the recording within the next day or 2 after we finish processing and getting it uploaded, so that everyone can access it. You can share that link with anyone that you think might find the content useful. So, for the Q&A portion, in addition to both Sean and Keith, I'm also joined by my colleague Pratap, who will be here to answer any technical questions. And just maybe to start things off, Sean, Keith, Pratap, any additional thoughts or things that you wanted to mention before we get into the Q&A section?
This is Sean here. I think not really anything in particular, but hopefully this gave a good overview of export control, CMMC, and that crossover, and then obviously flowing down to, from a technical perspective and solution perspective, how a digital rights management solution like NextLabs can help, because I think all 3 areas we're seeing clients go, they're going hand in hand in terms of consideration of CMMC requirements, how export controls plays into that, and then also what solutions are available to really support the compliance elements, and also just to support the overall program and certification.
Thanks, Sean. I'm not seeing any questions put in through the interface yet, but just wait for another minute or two to give everyone a chance to ask any questions. Okay. So a question here about the demos that we showed were with SAP, and the question is, does this work with other ERP systems? Short answer is yes. It does work with other systems. Prasad, maybe you can jump in with examples of exactly which other ERP systems our solutions work with.
Yeah. So thanks, Tony. So yeah, we pretty much have the dynamic authorization enforcement available for non-SAP applications. We have wide variety of the systems that we could support, starting from the traditional relational databases versus so the big data platforms and other ERP systems. We have a pretty flexible integration that we could do using this central policy platform.
Thanks, Prasad. We'll give everyone just another minute to see if there's any other questions out there. All right, great. Well, if there's no other questions now, I think that we're coming up on the hour, so we will call it a wrap. I'd like to thank Sean and Keith from Deloitte for joining us and offering their perspectives and their expertise. I also like to thank Pratap for joining for his technical knowledge as well on Next Labs products. And everyone who's on this webinar now should receive an email with a link to view the webinar, and please do feel free to share that with anyone else that you think might find it useful. With that though, I'll say thanks again for joining, and hopefully see you later. Bye.